tonight we're going to talk about, actually, we are not going to, but Lesley and Sarah from FACT will. The first one is a curatorial coordinator of FACT, and Sarah is, am I right, acting head of engagement?
Yeah.
Correct? Okay, good. They will talk about Sharon Lockhart's previous work and her project for Liverpool Biennial 2014. And then Anthony Huberman, one of the co-curators of Liverpool Biennial 2014, will actually pop in to answer your questions, hopefully, about Sharon Lockheart. He will be here around 7 or 7:15. Then we'll have a break, and then Vanessa Boni from Liverpool Biennial, she's public programs curator, will talk about the companion. And then again, Q&A, and then off we go. So, thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Lesley Taker. I'm the curatorial coordinator, and I've just been informed I have to use the mic because they're recording it, which I hate doing.
So we're here to talk about Sharon Lockheart, who, as you're saying, is our artist, is FACT's artist for the Liverpool Biennial 2014. It's a monograph, it's a solo show, and for those of you that don't know Sharon's work, she is a LA-based artist, and she's been exhibited internationally in America, Japan, the Netherlands. She's won a lot of awards for her film and her photography. She's quite inspired by cinema verite, by Jean Rouch. She loves kind of capturing moments and really delving into people's lives and how they live and their day-to-day. So obviously it's a very good choice for the biennial, which is kind of thematically based around the idea of the everyday and of domestic and small things being almost like a microcosm for these bigger, more philosophical, more conceptual ideas. And Sarah will talk a little bit more about how Sharon's work ties into that heavy sort of philosophical, conceptual side of things a bit later on. Basically, I'll just show you some photographs. So Sharon does these really beautiful still images, and there's quite a lot of them that are of children or are of environments that are created by children. So she's very interested in what happens when children feel that they're by themselves, or that they have a task that they can do, or if they're in their own like little environment without people watching. So something that I'll show you later, and is something that we'll have in fact in Gallery 1, is called Podvuka, and that is a still camera it's basically just watching children play. And kind of they run in and out of shot, so they can come into shot and come out of shot. She's very interested in kind of almost choreographing moments. So not necessarily choreographing their actions, their reactions, whatever, but making the context for the moment to happen so that they can explore their own feelings, their own behaviour. And her work is kind of somewhere in this middle ground of choreography and natural behaviour. So I was saying, you can see a couple more. And then the work that she's going to do for us in the new commission is, again, very heavily related to childhood. She's very interested, as I was saying, about children being allowed to find alternate modes of expression, being involved in discussions and not just being patronised and told what to think or given a very strict structure. It's more that she wants to question children in a leading way, so that it leads them not to an answer, but more to a mode of thinking, a mode of imagining, and a very creative process. So the work that she'll be doing with us, and again, as I said, Sarah will speak a little bit more about the new commission, really delves into this kind of practice of allowing children to have a space, and away from adults and away from kind of this conceptually heavy artistic hand. She's allowing them to kind of access more philosophical thinking, and she's not afraid of those more insecure moments or those more difficult moments, and that's something that through the process of designing the new commission, it's become very clear that the things that she's interested in at quite a deep level. So this is taken from one of her exhibitions in 2005 called Pine Flat, and basically she created a portrait studio for children so that they could go and take a photograph, and it was in this like quite beautiful, quite aesthetically pleasing, quite contemporary art setting, and they take basically a self-portrait with a photographer, and she exhibited these, and it's nice because like this conversation starts to come out. They have their own impression of what they want their identity to come across as. They choose what clothes to wear. So she had the kids coming back over and over again, like wearing different clothes, bringing their friends. So they felt like empowered by the process and wanted to create themselves. And as I was saying before, this kind of middle ground between behaviour and choreography is kind of what interests her in this line of her work, in which you will see very quickly when you come into fact, when we have the show in, is how architecturally stunning her work is. It's quite minimalist, it's very strong, it's very bright. Her installations are very sculptural and structural, and the sculpture or the structure is always connected to the concept of the work and the main themes of the work. So we have Double Tide here, and also there's a work called Lunch Break that are exhibited in this very long, better example actually, because the film is actually of a corridor. A big section of the film is of a corridor, and a lot of the shots are panning shots, but like very meticulously slow, almost unbearably slow panning shots, which really make you reanalyze all the detail in the shot. So it's like looking at a series of stills, but it has that fluidity and that movement. So having this in this huge, and the one for Lunch Break is gigantic, really long, almost like the back of an articulated truck, kind of lorry. You kind of walk down, so you're walking into this corridor of a film that's walking down a corridor or is experiencing a really long panning shot. So she's very interested in how you experience her work in the space, how you stand against her work, how you kind of feel within it, and how the sculptural reiteration of the pieces can support the kind of themes that she is starting to explore. And she works very closely with architects, so for a lot of the plans that we've been developing here at FACT, it's been with these architects that she works with constantly, like on all her projects, and she's very specific in her aesthetic, in the design. Things should be clean, it should all be about the moment. So you can tell by working with her in the more pragmatic sense of curation that, talk about the installation plans, how things should look, how things should feel in the space. It's very similar to how I'd imagine her creative processes, that she is very meticulous about the framing, about the shot. She's got a very clear image in her head about what she would like to create, but within that there's also room for dialogue, a discussion with the subject of her photography, and in a lot of cases like the children in her photography. And just to give you a bit more idea of how sculptural her work is, there's another, this is actually a 5-channel video piece, but you can only see 4 here, of just projected video work, and it's just like this beautiful, very strong statement. And I think one of the things that you'll realise very quickly when you come into the new show is how sparse, how very bold a lot of the movement is in her work, that she's making very bold statements in no uncertain terms, both conceptually and aesthetically. And I think in our galleries, particularly in Gallery 1, which is a very large space, if any of you've experienced it as an open space, having just one work, which I'll show you in a little moment, is a very bold statement and will look incredible and will definitely drag people in. So I'll show you Podvorka, which is that work. And this is an installation shot from Toronto, and I'll show you a still and some of the video for that, so you can kind of get a feel of her work and how still it is, how quiet it is, how meditative it is, and how concentrated it is on behaviour and the moment, because she's very interested in that moment. So obviously it's very sculptural. You have these two walls facing each other. It's podwórko literally means play courtyard, and it's these courtyards that the Polish children reappropriate as their playground. So this was in Łódź in Poland, and she filmed, it's predominantly 2 boys and 2 girls, and it's here that she discovered someone who would lead into her later practice and be very, very prominent, called Milena. She's the sister of one of the 2 boys, and we'll talk about her a little bit more in a minute, but I just thought I would let you see a little bit of the film. There's only about 4 minutes or so, so just to give you a little bit of an idea. that was a really short extract from Podworker. It's a half-hour long film. So I've just put this quote up from Sharon Lockheart from an interview about her film work and her approach to documentary filmmaking. And as you could see from that snippet, she is very interested in like documentary photography and film. She's also interested in, and this echoes it, ethnology and anthropology. And that's what I was saying about Jean Rouch before. She has got a lot of respect for him about how he totally changed the genre, how he appropriated different sociological practices within his documentary film and really explored it as a genre and really opened up how it allowed him to discover other things and allowed him to discover more about his own practice as well as the people he was working with. Her work inhabits, as I was saying, this middle ground between the photographic and the filmic, and it epitomises that search for that perfect moment of stillness, of reflection, and really allows her to kind of work through quite important or difficult questions or situations from this very like minimalist, distinct aesthetic. So you see that her photographs that I showed you before are meticulously staged as if it's like a moment frozen in time, and her work, so like that was a 30-minute film, and Lunch Break is also quite a long film. It's just allowing you to kind of sit with a situation and really reflect on it, while, you know, it's not throwing particular dogma at you, it's not throwing a particular political situation at you, it's obviously allowing you to experience it and allow you to get into it in whichever way that you can. And one of the girls in that video, she was wearing a pink top, she was like the older girl she ran past, that was Milena. And Sharon Lockheart has got this relationship with Milena that has just grown and grown and grown, and Milena told her that she would really like to write an autobiography, and a lot of her practice with Milena, which has gone on, is still going on now, so it's been like 10 years, 6 years, is about that kind of finding a way to help Milena write her story or to discover her own narrative. So the work that we are going to show, the new commission, involves Milena. And these are some pictures of her taken recently for a Netherlands show. And the work that Sharon's going to be doing is in Poland, so she's doing a residency in Poland, and Sarah will tell you a little bit more about this. The residence she's doing there is with some young women, and the end project's going to be a feature-length film that will be premiered at the end of the biennial. And the practice within the film is about collaboration, is about, as I was saying before, those ideas of philosophical thinking, of education, but like alternative modes of education, how young people and children react differently if you teach them differently or if you give them alternate modes or alternate methods where they're used to obviously a very didactic, very specific structure. And so that's what we're going to have upstairs in Gallery 2. In Gallery 2, the presentation will reflect these main ideas behind that new commission, and we're still in the process of knowing exactly what that will be. But given some of the other very strongly aesthetic and very definite installation pieces that I've already shown, and I'll show you a couple of more images now, we kind of have a vague idea of what it'll feel like and what it needs to feel like to coincide with Podworker downstairs, and to kind of continue that narrative and show how the work that she did in Poland with Podworker and how she met Milena, and that has kind of carried through and is opened up into this other side of her own artistic practice and her own artistic narrative. So I've got some shots from previous installations that she's done that kind of just give you an idea of how, as I was saying, how stark and how beautifully simplistic her installs are. She's very interested in objects as kind of personal histories. So this is from Lunch Break, the film about the work, as I was telling you about before, with the very long tracking shots. and basically Sharon collected photographs of all their lunch boxes and the actual things themselves, and she took photographs of them as a unit and then with all of the debris outside, so it kind of shows a life and it opens up the men in this way to display them in a very artistic, artifact-based way. And then the next one is from the same 5-channel installation I showed you before, but the reason I've showed this and the next picture as well is because of the plinths that are used, these kind of real low-level horizontal plinths. Sharon's really interested in the staging, and this is her show. And I think it works really nicely with the idea of the work being about reflection, being about taking things from a different angle, and also in a very basic way. It works quite nicely with the idea of the children and of play and of them being able to see the work and really, like, you know, on every level. So yeah, I'm going to let Sarah talk a little bit more about the collaborative practice of the piece, but before that she'll talk a little bit more about our own engagement and collaboration programme, which is core to kind of FACT's aims, and she'll tell you a little bit more about alternate forms of education. And yeah, good morning, Sarah.
Lesley?
Hi, I just want to quickly welcome Anthony Huberman, who's now here. Hello, Anthony. Who's curator on Liverpool Biennial. So Anthony, if you want to chip in at any point, please feel free. Yeah, so I just wanted to give you a little, I'm Sarah Bailey, I just wanted to give a quick overview on the engagement programme at FACT, purely because when we're in this building engaging with this work, it will give you a sense of the kind of people who we work with regularly and how this work situates in terms of other collaborative practice. So I'm going to fly through that and then I'm going to come back to this piece. However, before I do that, I would like you to all get up and sit with somebody different. Question, which is, what does it mean to be a child? With your new neighbour.
Yeah, true. It's still got very immature things. I don't feel as old as I feel. I refuse to accept. Like,
Okay, you could just stop there. Can you just call out a few things that you discussed?
Curiosity.
To be curious.
You have a sense of freedom, like, yeah.
Okay, to have a sense of freedom.
Imagination.
To have imagination. Now, I could take any one of these areas that you're coming back with and then question you about that. And we could go on in that discussion forever and ever. And between that, the kind of rich dialogue that we'd experience would really start to help us think more broadly about what it is to be a child and what it is to be a human being. But I will explain a bit more about why I did that shortly. But first, a little overview of collaboration and engagement at FACT. So we have 5 areas of programme. We have, you will, if you're in this building, in relation to Sharon's work, you will come across some young people. We have extensive practice with young people linked to film and art and technology. We also have a strand that looks specifically at mental health. This is an example of an app that we've developed recently that young people have collaborated with app designers to produce, which you can download on your iPhone. Other phones are available at your leisure. It's a really interesting example of what happens when you collaborate with young people to produce something. We have a learning programme which focuses primarily on formal education and family learning. So Minecraft, as you can see in the background, is something that features heavily. So we look at film, art, technology and families as different modes for exploring learning. And this is an example of a co-produced project where we've looked at how you can develop skills in co-design as collaborators from a very young age by using a platform that most people of a certain age have had on their tablets or on their computer at some point. It's a really accessible starting point. Unusually, we have a programme with military veterans. As far as we know, have I just skipped one? There's one missing. Never mind. With military veterans, which is unusual, so we have a number of veterans who use the building regularly. That is explicitly a creative programme that supports veterans to kind of explore alternative ways to express themselves in their transition to civilian life. So that might involve working on animation, on film production. There's a website being developed, which you're all welcome to come and see in July, which will be launched in July, which hopefully will roll out nationally. We have a health programme, so that focuses on how we can work with people who've experienced ill health of various kinds. There's quite a strong theme of mental health there, which these films are available on the website. You can have a look at them. This was working with an animator called Babis, whose surname I can't remember. Neither can Lesley. He's a fabulous animator. Worked with 5 people to tell their stories about recovery. So he worked alongside them using a methodology that most of them hadn't engaged with before to both tell their stories but also to kind of aid their progression in their journeys towards recovery. And then last but by no means least, and not illustrated, we have a communities programme where primarily we work with a lot of older people in Liverpool in sheltered housing schemes. And that's very much focused around digital inclusion and again the creation of new work. So the kind of underlying message, I guess, is in relation to people who come in and use this building is we want everybody to be collaborating and making and producing as much as possible. So that's kind of the ethos that underpins it and where it kind of situates in terms of Sharon's work. So Lesley kind of alluded to it earlier, and in fact it was referenced on the previous slide. So Sharon's heavily influenced by a Polish educator, paediatrician, orphanage director, turn of the 20th century, called Janusz Korczak, which I may have got the pronunciation wrong, but that's his name. So his thinking was very much around the rights of the child. Now the rights of the child is something that was in the news a lot, perhaps more under the last administration, the current one, and the UK has kind of done a lot of work around how to explore children's rights and make them more adhered to, more considered and more sort of pronounced in the public space. So his thinking actually, Korczak's thinking really kind of, if you then look at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is available to download, and you're very welcome to go and find out more, which was initially kind of tabled in 1989, I think, and then approved in 1990. Those rights that are underpinned in there are very much around, there's a whole load of things that you would expect, like food, housing, the right to be loved, the right to play. But fundamental, I think, particularly in Sharon's work, is this idea about the right to have a voice, and particularly the right to have a voice in decisions about things that affect you and about your kind of lived experience. So the UK actually has ratified that for its own use, but it's not in legislation, so that we say we like it, but it doesn't necessarily come out in our laws, which is quite an interesting context. So she's interested in kind of producing a manifesto that really speaks to that agenda around young people's right to have a voice, and particularly the children that she's working with in Poland. So the process for producing this manifesto is over a period of 6 weeks. She'll be working with a group of 20 young women in a Polish orphanage 3 times a week, and they'll have dinner, they'll have lessons, they'll have lots and lots of discussion. And the person that she's working with is a guy who's coming over here, which we're very excited about at the beginning of the biennial, called Bartosz Prispel. And his work is primarily as a kind of educational philosopher. So he's interested in the kind of philosophical thinking that can be explored through education. Now, his work, he wrote a book called Philosophy and Education, or Philosophy and Education and Critical Thinking, or words to that effect. He's a very, his work is very interesting from what I've seen of it. His book is currently being translated, so we don't have it in full translation. So I'm going to give you a flavour of philosophy and education in this country, just to kind of give you an idea of the principles and the context for it. So the question that I gave you earlier about what it means to what is a child, what does it mean to be a child, is an example that you might use. And I've seen Philosophy for Education. It's run by an organisation called Sapir in the UK, and John Moores has a philosopher in residence who is interested in this practice, who we're trying to talk to about being involved in this work. So the principle of it is really about thinking, reasoning and questioning. It's much less of I'm going to ask you a child a question, but I'm only going to ask you a question that I know the answer to, because otherwise it'll be really awkward if I ask you something I don't know the answer to. And then I look like a fool. What will I do then if I ask a question to which I don't know the answer? So it's very much about kind of critical thinking, getting us to think about the big, important issues that we have. So other questions might include things like, what does it mean, what's imagination? Or how do you know what dying feels like? Or what does it mean to love a friend? Or these are the kind of big, interesting philosophical questions that Sharon wants to get to grips with in her work. So in Gallery 2, so the Gallery 1, which is just outside of here, will have Podwerka, which Lesley mentioned earlier. In Gallery 2, there'll be a collection of kind of ephemera that will shift as the exhibition goes on, and will capture moments from the process in Poland, ultimately leading to a presentation of the film which will be captured. So all I should have said, actually, I wasn't explicit about that. The process that they go through in Poland will be captured by Sharon and her team, so they'll be filming it all the way through, and then that film will be shown in October, towards the end of the biennial. So Gallery 2 will capture work as it's produced that comes out of that process. So I think, in a nutshell, fairly large nutshell, that's it in terms of philosophy for educational philosophy and Sharon's work and how that fits together. But ultimately what that will create, as you can imagine, we don't quite know what the film will look like yet, but we will end up with a fairly rich narrative that really allows the girls' voices to come through. Ultimately, we are interested in maybe extending the commission to feature a similar residency in Liverpool. But yeah, it would be really interesting to see what material appears. Anything to add?
Yes.
Yes?
Anthony, Anthony Huberman is here.
Okay, great.
He should.
Yeah, great.
Go on stage.
Welcome, Anthony.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you have questions, you should really ask Anthony, I think.
Although I think this was a very, 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 very good introduction and presentation to some of the ideas that have been going on. So perfectly done. I mean, just a few words from in terms of Sharon's practice in general. As you guys have all just heard, that what she's doing for the biennial is something very new, and is something that's happening literally right as we speak right now, where she's in a farmhouse outside of Warsaw with a group of young girls and a whole camera crew. But you know, the thing that for me is also really interesting about Sharon's work is that she, you know, at the end of the day, what she's interested in is people, right? And she's interested in what the conditions that dictate and determine and guide and condition the ways in which people might behave and spend their time. And a lot of the time, those conditions or those structures or those places or those relationships within which we live and within which we allow us to make our decisions, you know, some of those things are of our own choosing, and so many of those things are not of our own choosing. You know, for example, for children, you know, unfortunately, it's oftentimes not up to them as to how they decide to spend their time, and exactly who, what, how, and why their activities and decisions are being governed and are being decided upon traditionally by their parents or by adults. And Sharon is just kind of interested in that whole phenomenon and wants to spend, and really is interested in how people navigate that. And the thing that I really also am struck by is that, you know, if you're interested in people, the only way to do something, to make work and artwork that speaks to that interest, is really to spend a lot of time with those people. And so Sharon is not the drop-in, drop-out ethnographer who, you know, there's many artists out there who are like, oh, I'm interested in doing a film about a particular group of people in particular communities, so I'm going to go there and do a residency and meet some people and film them, and then that'll make my film. That's really, it's really important to understand that's not at all how Sharon works. Sharon made the film with Lunch Break, for example, with a group of workers at an iron steel shop, iron factory, a steel factory. Not only did that take a year of planning and a year of conversation of getting to know these people, and then a second year of shooting and editing, but this all took place in her hometown. So all of these people and her relationships with learning how to talk to these people is something that profited and benefited and required in her entire life's familiarity with the specificity of that town and that context. This is where she grew up. So all of her projects really require and use and feed off of a really long-term commitment to people with whom she commits and with whom she wants to really kind of develop a relationship. And so this project is, again, not just oh, I'm interested in the rights of children, and so I'm going to gather 12 young Polish girls in a house and spend 2 weeks with them. This is, again, another iteration of something an interest that began with Podworka in 2009, several years ago, where she first met this group of young girls, or this one girl and her brother and a group of others, and that has led to a unbelievably rich and complicated relationship she's had with Milena, most of which has nothing to do with making art and doing a film or a project, but some of which does. And it really is the result of this very extensive amount of time. I think her time, my suspicion is that she's probably going to meet someone here in Liverpool at some point in the next few months, and maybe 5 or 6 years from now, after some kind of relationship or some kind of process, is that person or that experience or that phenomenon going to appear in a work by Sharon Lockheart. That's just kind of how she works and how she thinks. And so what we have here is really we're benefiting from many, many years of her spending time with Milena, many, many years of her having spent time thinking through Korczak's philosophies, and allowing that finally to be able to yield a really major new film commission. There's not that many films by Sharon Lockheart, and so this is really a kind of a special opportunity for all of us here to be able to make possible something as ambitious as what she's been inspired to do in this context. But I'm happy to answer, or all of us maybe should come up to answer any questions that you guys might have. Yeah.
The girls are from an orphanage, you know, I believe.
Yeah.
Now, was that a conscious decision made, so it reduces the influence of parents, you know, things like attachment things to do with orphans and adoptees and stuff like this?
Yeah.
So the experience of an adopted or an orphan child is going to be different to a child growing up within a family.
That's right.
And maybe it's a bit of a looser experience to a regular life. Was that a conscious decision to pick those children for those reasons, or did it just sort of happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. the reason that that orphanage was chosen is because it all starts, again, with the specificity of this one girl and her brother. The orphanage, and Milena and her brother have been in separate orphanages over the past many years. And over the past several years, as Sharon has been getting to know Milena, she's been spending a lot of time at Milena's orphanage. And it's that orphanage that she has now chosen. I actually don't know if she's chosen the 12 girls who are with her, or I'm not sure who is in their rented house right now. But it's very much tied to the people who were part of this environment that Milena has been a part of for a long time and that Sharon has gotten to know. But you're right, that is something to be said. Maybe you guys can speak to that. I mean, we are talking about a project that's about the child's voice, the child asserting his or her, or in this case her, authority in terms of determining what they want to say and how they want to behave and what they think about the nature of love and friendship and freedom, and for these abstract questions to be really answered by the authority of a child's perspective. But you're right that perspective is a specific one in this case. This is not just any child. We are dealing with a very specific audience here. How that relates to larger abstract questions of pedagogy and educational systems is an open one. Yeah, I don't know if you guys have any.
I guess just to say that whichever child you work with, no one comes without context. Do you know what I mean? So I think you're right. It is a very
specific, atypical one, though, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Not a regular.
Yeah, and
Which is the
interestingly,
interesting thing.
yeah, absolutely right. And also in terms of the kind of state care, that can vary enormously, cultural context to cultural context. So I think all of those things are kind of coming together and crystallising in the moment of this film, based on a relationship. I think.
I think one of the things that's interesting as well is that in that, as you were saying, it's a very atypical. It's very, that is that context, but it's a very structured context, but it's also very structureless. So that's obviously very attractive to Sharon because it's that kind of juxtaposition of two very different worlds at the same time, and obviously it's very interesting when you think about the more alternative modes of education and how people experience things differently. So, it's very different to talk about, say, a child who has like a nuclear family and goes to school every single day and, experiences a very certain world every single day. And then it's very different, obviously, to talk about these kids who've come in at whatever age, from whatever context, and are being treated all the same in some ways, but are very aware of how different they are from one another, how very different they are from what they perceive to be like the wider context. And I think, as I'm going to be saying, that Sharon's very interested in giving voice to experience, and it's particularly interesting for her to give voice to those experiences because they are atypical, I think.
Yeah.
Are they all the same age?
They are around 12 to.
Peer group, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a range.
There's no developmental slight differences.
Yeah.
So they're going to be filmed. Do they know? They obviously know, therefore, that they're going to be filmed. Do the children know that where the film is going and the context in which the film will be seen? And do you think that changes how they will act and behave in the film?
It might very well change.
Yeah.
It might change it for sure. Again, this is another reason why the building of relationship over many years comes into play, right? It's only thanks to that she can assemble and earn the trust of this group of people, and that is fundamental. But you can have all the trust that you want. There are still cameras in the room, so.
Yeah. And I guess in terms of the kind of wider picture of ethnography, that's a really varied practice out before you get into sort of the production of artwork. So even there are ethnographers, some of whom will go into a context, be very clear about what their brief is, be clear about who they are, not make any attempt to kind of hide out, and other ethnographers who I'm perhaps less comfortable with, who might kind of pretend to be something other than who they are in order to blend in, which clearly there are huge ethical issues with. So no, as far as I know, it's a really kind of explicit process about.
Remember that what they're doing, it's not really just like MTV's Real World, where they're just hanging out, eating together. The reason she's bringing on this Bartek, this philosopher, is that he has developed specific exercises and curricula which have as a goal and an aim to draw out of someone's own sense of self-confidence and self-reliance and ability to be able to feel that they have the authority to speak. So they're going to be following, it's the length of time, not just arbitrarily, because that's the minimum length of time as determined by this philosopher that this group of children need to follow a kind of curriculum. Literally, that's what they're doing. So while there is lots of free time and lots of playing, but there is still a part of this experience is very much of a structured one. So I think that the cameras being there aren't completely out of sync with the somewhat structured nature of what they're doing every day.
I'm just saying what Sarah's saying about ethnography and it being very varied practice. I think that Sharon has been very open about how open she is. Like when she did lunch break, she went in, she spent a long time there. The guys were asking what she was doing. She said, okay, I work in like this kind of a way. I am exhibited in these kind of international contexts, you know, that she's very giving about exactly how she wants the work to kind of be presented at the end point and how she anticipates it will. And so the guys in that film and like the kids in that film knew that, and like at some level knew that because she'd, you know, communicated it. And that's when I was talking about before, that kind of middle ground between behaviour and choreography.
Yeah.
That's kind of where that comes up, and that's, I think the camera adds to that, because she's like, there's a camera stood in the middle of a playground. It's not like, you know, oh, act like I'm not here. The whole thing is the process. And when we heard her speak a few months back, she said that that process becomes actually quite a beautiful thing, because the kids particularly, and even the adults, like she said, it happens very much with the adults in the steel factory, they want to portray themselves in a certain way. And the same with the portraits that we saw from flat pine. They want to act in a certain way, but it's allowing them to act like that. It's allowing them that moment. And she will have discussions with them. And she said at first, you know, she gave them a bit of choreographical like instruction. She said, why don't you do that? Or, you know, this might be interesting, or that was a really nice shot. So they respond to her, almost to her pleasure in the film and her aesthetic pleasure as a director and as an artist and, you know, producer of work. They would respond to that in a very certain way. So I think, as I said, it is that kind of middle ground between what they would normally do and what they are doing, not because she's told them to, but because of the context that they're in.
And she's going to get a lot more, you know, even for lunch break, you know, hours and hours and hours of footage was taken of them doing all sorts of different things. And then it's over the process of that, like you said, that she arrived at this point of saying, you know what, the only thing that actually is going to make the film is this single shot of the lunch break. But that's not something she went into it knowing, you know, it really comes out of her time spent with them.
What was the impact like after the films with the communities that have been in? Because the two guys who are kind of climbing all over in the outside, like in an orphanage, has that had a repercussion in like how are we looking after these kids? They're loose, completely free, or is it kind of accepted and they're quite happy for them to be free? Has it impacted on their freedom?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think we have very particular views of childhood which are really cultural. So there are some cultures where we are more risk averse with our children than others. So if you look at children's literature, it's a really good example of this. If you look at kind of Scandinavian children's stories as opposed to ours, they are kind of, I don't know if you've read Pippi Longstocking, but people fall over, they hurt themselves, they make mistakes, they're naughty. Sometimes they don't get caught. Like, whereas ours tend to be quite, our traditional stories can be quite moralistic, they can be kind of quite didactic in the way that they're expressing stories. So your point about the children, there is follow-up. She does work with professionals in the context, so she isn't working in isolation. So in the example of the new work, she's working with somebody who's an educator. She'll be working with somebody who's related to the orphanage. So, for example, if that happens in Liverpool, you can imagine, your question's exactly right, but I think it's something for us to interrogate, and it almost doesn't matter kind of what we think of, you see what I'm trying to say, I think. So there's a kind of cultural consideration there, but there's certainly follow-up, and the right professionals are in the space, but all of those people in that mix are going to have a different view on what's appropriate, what's safe, what's kind of constructive and useful play.
Somebody just set up a playground in North Wales somewhere, I don't know where exactly. And the idea is it isn't usual playground furniture. It's like saws provided and they let the kids burn things.
Yeah, there's loads of examples. If you look at Tinkering School in the States, that's a really interesting one. So people bringing in old washing machines for children to go and strip down so they understand how they work. There's a strong movement in the kind of play area to talk about risk-benefit and balancing understanding how you can support children to take risks in a way. So the example that my former teacher of mine gave was if there's some concrete steps and a child goes straight to the 6th step and tries to jump off it, you probably want to intervene. But if they start at the first step and jump off it, and then they go to the second one, and then they go to the third one, and they're actually managing, it's about that kind. This is a whole other can of worms. You can talk about this all day, but there are lots of discussions about how we support children to grow healthily and safe without kind of stifling them. I guess it's a really interesting balance, though.
But I also think it's important for Sharon, in Sharon's case, that it's like it's done in concert with the context. Like the Podworka would never have happened in Liverpool for the simple reason that activity would never have come across either Sharon or the child's mind to behave that way. I mean, it's always very, very much tied to the fact that particular little village had no playground, right? And yet these children have a need to play, and that she observed them desperately trying to insert that spaces of play in this barren, and it's only because of the specificity of that context that whole film then come. So because that specificity is totally other here, that film would never and could never have taken place in that way in Liverpool. So it's not like she's like, oh, I have an idea. I'm going to get a bunch of kids and have them do reckless things on the set to build a play. That's not how this goes. That's not how that works. Yeah.
Is there a big impact on the children after she's left them? This is this big involvement in the film and obviously on their lives. But when she's gone.
Yeah, it's a good question.
It's a good question. I mean, I think it depends film by film with the impact on everyone's again, this is not just children she's worked with. You know, in Podworka's case, it had a pretty massive impact because she began a really, really many year friendship with Milena, and have brought her to various parts of the world and has supplied her with a computer and various equipment, and has really become an important part of Milena's life. And so that was the beginning of a relationship that certainly made a huge impact on Milena's life, for example. And I think that the other kids in that, and you know, this is only, the way Sharon describes the shooting of that is that Milena was her DP, right? She was the person telling the boys, like, what to do, basically. And it's because of that kind of amazing assertiveness and amazing, like, talk about the children's voice. Here I am, the artist from Los Angeles, in this village in Poland, and here is this 10-year-old who is clearly taking reins and control over my shooting schedule and telling her brother and his friends what to do, and that's what really was like, there's a spark to this young girl. There's something really amazing about it, and that led to, you know, I think the boys and just basically were having a fun time that afternoon. I'm not sure how much they made of it afterwards in terms of it being anything other than playing around in the street.
Yeah.
But I think it really depends. You know, in that case, the boys played around in the street, and Milena met someone who then has now become a really prominent person in her life.
And I guess the whole thing is mediated by those important adults to those children who are in that context as a not permanent but a longer term fixture. So I guess so if we were doing it in this context, we wouldn't do it without guidance and kind of collaboration with those adults who knew those children and were able to look out for their